Hello, you're watching Talking Europe on France 24. I'm Catherine Nicholson in Brussels at the European Council Summit. I'm joined here today by a man who's just taken on responsibility for overseeing the European Union's foreign relations, High Representative Josep Borrell. Thank you very much for being our guest today.
Thanks, thank you.
I'd like to start off by talking about a country that is currently an EU member, but will soon become a third country outside of the EU, the United Kingdom. We've had a decisive result in the British general election, meaning that Brexit, the withdrawal, will happen soon. Do you believe that the UK will remain a close partner of the EU after it's left, considering the difficulties that there have been with the negotiations up to now?
I hope so. I hope there will still be a lot of links, especially on strategic issues, on trade for sure. And the chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, will take care of a negotiation for a future relation. We are going to open a delegation in London, and we are going to open an office for the United Kingdom's relations. It's amazing, but the United Kingdom will be considered as a third country from the European Union point of view.
When there's that whole new relationship to be negotiated, the current timescale is extremely short, according to anybody that you speak to. The transition period due to end in 1 year's time, end of December 2020. Is it really feasible for the UK and the EU to renegotiate and formalise their entire relationship in that time span?
That's what we have to try, and we will engage.
You think it could be done?
It has to be done. It has to be done. We will engage all our efforts. We already have a big guidelines on the agreement of the withdrawal agreement. There is a political declaration who sets a clear guideline for the future status. And well, maybe something will have to be dealt with after, but the core of the future relations has to be decided in this time.
And what about the security cooperation with the United Kingdom, which is such an important issue, both for the UK and the EU, especially in this time, as we know, of heightened threats? How big a concern is that to you? It is one of your specific responsibilities.
I think it's in our mutual interest. Both sides, United Kingdom as a third country and the European Union, we share a lot of common points of view on the global stage. And there are many issues in which we have to cooperate, from sanctions to strategic issues, intelligence, the fight against fake news, cyber war.
Do you think Boris Johnson will be a reliable partner for the EU in those negotiations, considering the very fiery rhetoric that we have heard from himself and other pro-Brexit politicians?
Yeah, well, now the game is over. Finally, it seems that he has a majority at the British Parliament to decide for the Brexit to take place. And once the Brexit has taken place, we will rely on each other in order to build the better cooperation among us.
You think Boris Johnson might soften his stance?
He's the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. We have to deal with him, and I have fully confidence that we are going to work on a mutual interest.
Well, let's talk about some more general European foreign policy concerns. In your first press conference as High Representative, you said you want to promote more effective EU foreign policy. It's true the EU has been criticised in recent years for being immobile, moving too slowly or not at all on certain issues. Some issues where foreign policy has been considered ineffective, for example, the Iran nuclear deal, the United States dropping out of that deal. How would you make EU foreign policy more effective? Perhaps changing the voting system so that you no longer need unanimous consent from every member state?
Don't start from the most difficult thing, because to change unanimity, I need unanimity. It cannot change unanimity without everybody agreeing on that. And it's going to be quite difficult, not only in foreign policy, in many other issues of the European Union. We work on the basis of unanimity, and it makes more difficult to reach agreements. But Iran, for example, the Iran deal, if the Iran deal is still alive, it's thanks partly, but mainly to the European Union. I am the coordinator of the working group that keep alive this deal, and we have a lot of interest on keeping it alive. For sure, you can be more proactive, but a common doesn't mean a unique foreign policy. Common doesn't mean that everybody agrees on all aspects of foreign policies.
Well, just speaking specifically about Iran, as we mentioned it there, you said that all the participants in the Iran nuclear deal stand behind it and want to preserve it. But how to achieve that? The United States, as we know, pulled out last year and reimposed sanctions. Iran itself has breached the limit on its stockpile of low-enriched uranium. Is this really salvageable?
Breach the limit doesn't mean to overpass the limit. It is still inside the limits, so I have to recognize that in spite of the unilateral withdrawal of the United States from this agreement, Iran has been mainly fulfilling its commitments, and we want them to continue doing so in order to keep alive an agreement that for us Europeans is very important for our security.
And just in terms of Iran as a partner that the EU can work with, there's been that recent violent repression of protests in Iran.
We have condemned it. We have condemned it strongly. We have been delivering certain notice about it. We do whatever we can in order to make it clear that we condemn this repression. But one thing is one thing and another thing is another thing. The nuclear deal is one thing, and the fact that the regime has reacted violently against the demonstrators, which has been strongly condemned by the European Union.
Well, let's look at Ukraine, an issue of foreign policy that is on the EU's borders. More than 13,000 lives have been lost there over 5 years of conflict between Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed ones. Now, there was a recent summit in Paris between the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, France and Germany. Before we talk about that, I'd just like to give a recap to our viewers of some of the outcomes from that summit in Paris. Here's Ellen Gainsford.
It wasn't quite a breakthrough peace plan, but the leaders pledged to start winding down the conflict. After at least 8 hours of talks, all 4 parties were able to agree on some key points. A full ceasefire by the end of the year and the release of conflict-related detainees, along with the withdrawal of troops from some conflict zones by March 2020. Vladimir Putin hailed the talks as a success.
This is certainly an important step towards de-escalating the situation in eastern Ukraine, as well as easing the tensions.
It was the first time Ukraine's new president and his Russian counterpart had sat down together. But Volodymyr Zelensky was more muted in his response, saying he'd been hoping more would be resolved.
I reiterate how vital it is for Ukraine to restore control over the entire length of its border. I am sure that we will come back to this issue in 4 months when we have the next summit. I have also said, once again, how vital it is to see the withdrawal of all foreign armed groups and foreign forces.
With more work to do, Emmanuel Macron announced plans for a follow-up summit to take stock of progress in 2020. The talks follow a big prisoner swap and the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from key areas on the front line. But disagreements remain, including over the status of the Donbass region, control of the border, and proposed elections in areas held by separatist pro-Moscow rebels. Russia continues to deny direct involvement in the fighting, admitting only that Russian volunteers are present on the ground. At least 14,000 people have died since the conflict broke out in 2014, and 1 million people have been displaced.
Josep Borrell, the deadline that we heard there in that report of the end of this year for implementing a full and comprehensive ceasefire in the east of Ukraine. That is a fortnight away. The ceasefire has been violated multiple times in the past. Why on earth should we think that this deadline can be kept?
Hope is the last thing that you lost. But the meeting in Paris, I think, has been very helpful, because there is a strong agreement, all the parties sitting together. The fact that they sit together is already a good news. They have agreed on a complete ceasefire, a disengagement of the forces, exchanging of prisoners. All of them will be exchanged. These are important steps to stabilization of the situation. It doesn't mean that it's bringing a political solution. It will take more. It will take longer. But at least don't dismiss such an agreement, which for many Ukrainian families will facilitate to spend a better Christmas time.
The EU imposed sanctions on Russia in 2014 when the conflict in Ukraine was beginning. Those sanctions have just been renewed at the European Council. Considering the developments in Paris, how long do you think that those sanctions can or should be maintained?
From my point of view, the sanctions should be maintained unless there is some change from the Russian side. We cannot take out sanctions without any move from the Russian side. And by the time being, this has not been produced. We don't like sanctions. Sanctions by itself is not a policy. Sanctions is a way of reacting against something that you cannot accept. And sanctions will be relieved when there is a reaction from the other side.
Okay, let's move on to events in Africa now. In recent days, there's been an attack on a military base in Niger that was the deadliest in quite a few years. And it was the latest in a series of deadly attacks in the Sahel region that have been attributed to Islamist militants. France particularly involved in the region, but the EU as a whole says in its own official documents it's committed to the security and development of the Sahel. So in light of these attacks, which seem to be growing in frequency and in size, can we expect any action from the European Union?
That's true. It has been a real massacre. 70 soldiers in Niger, and some days ago 49 soldiers in Mali, and 13 French soldiers. I was at Paris on their burial. The situation is not good. It's still worsening. But this requires a bigger effort from European member states and from the European Union. We are spending quite a lot of money there. We have a lot of people, and it's not enough. We cannot let this big region in Africa to become a political vacuum where terrorists can develop. We have a military mission with almost 1,000 soldiers and 2 civilian missions to train the Malis and Niger. And in the next days, the President of the French Republic will call for a meeting. He will start thinking about how can we improve our presence there.
We're just staying in Africa, Libya, in a full-blown civil war. It would seem a proxy war, in fact. But Turkey and Qatar supporting what's known as the Government of National Accord in Tripoli. We've got the UAE, Saudi Arabia, France and Russia backing forces led by General Khalifa Haftar. Again, a country on the EU's doorstep and one with which the EU is cooperating over undocumented migration. You recently said the EU should be able to do more on Libya. What did you mean by that? Because, of course, many people in Europe worried and tired of seeing their countries getting involved in conflicts overseas.
Well, they are right on being worried. The first thing that we have to do about Libya is to build and unite among us, because that's clear that not all European countries have the same approach to the Libya situation. To build an internal unity is the precondition in order to play a bigger role. Nobody's talking about a military intervention in Libya, by the way.
Can the EU offer any incentives in that case to the two sides to start a process towards talking about a ceasefire?
This is the diplomatic work we are doing. There is a UN envoy. We are supporting him as much as we can, but we cannot prevent the fight just by miracle. We have to continue this silent work and trying to make the legitimate government being able to restore control on the territories, but it's out of the way, it's out of the image of anyone, a military intervention of the European countries in Libya, like someone sometimes has proposed.
And just sticking with Libya, as I mentioned, there is that cooperation with the European Union on undocumented migration. France 24 has reported quite extensively from Libya recently, and it's seen, very, very poor treatment of migrants who've been, left in boats without blankets. They've been put into detention centres in deplorable conditions.
We are trying to help the ONGs and the United Nations organizations in order to improve the situation of these migrants, and we are sending back home to many of them. They have been stuck, they cannot cross the Mediterranean, and many of them would like to go back to their homes. And we have a program in order to help them to go back. And in the meantime, we do our best, cooperating with the ONGs and the United Nations organizations to help them to improve their situation, but we are not there on the ground.
Considering that a new commission, of which you of course are part, has just started work, is that a moment for a more serious overhaul, a more serious rethink about the EU's migration position? Perhaps a stronger push for that thing that has never been found yet, pan-EU migration policy?
We have been looking for it for years, and we haven't found it. That's true. It's a big failure for the European Union, not being able to have a common asylum policy and a common policy in order to face the migration. But people get a little bit confused because the images they kept in mind are the images of 2015, 2016, when it was a big flow of refugees coming or leaving Syria due to the war. This is not the normal state of the situation. Today, the flow of migrants is about 40,000 people a year. On those days, we were talking about 1 million or 1.5 million. This was a critical moment, it was a peak. And people get confused between migration and this big flow of refugees, of people escaping from a war.
Well, Josep Borrell, unfortunately, that is all we have time for, but thank you very much for being our guest on France 24.
Thank you, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks. Thanks to you as well for watching the programme, and do, of course, please stay with us for part 2 of the programme, which will be coming up in a few minutes' time.